let's go on a walk and see if we can ID some of the trees we find. Okay, the first one is elder. Let's try and find some buds on it. So elder has this kind of spotty, gnarly bark. It also has hollow stems, so if you were to snap one, you would find a really soft pith in the middle of the stem that can be easily scraped out. And if it were a dead stem, you would see that it would possibly be hollow. In terms of the buds, they're opposite each other. They're quite purple coloured, and they're quite large, and they're ragged, so the ends of the leaf scales are they're not that neat and rounded, they're kind of hanging out a bit. So they're described as being ragged buds. And if you get a big elder trunk, the bark is pretty squishy and cork-like. So this is the trunk of that elder. It's quite soft, I can feel it moving under my thumb. And then the young shoots tend to grow quite vertically, so they will shoot up, straight up like that. So elder's quite good for hand drill, for friction fire. You can eat the flowers in springtime. It's not great for burning though, because the smoke is slightly toxic. See, there's one bud there, and there was one on the other side, but it's broken off. So make sure when you're IDing that you look at a few different stems. Even this really young stem, it's got these spots, kind of like bumps, raised bumps on it. So that's Sabucus nigra elder. And then right behind it here we've got holly, pretty easy to identify. Waxy leaf, doesn't always necessarily have the spikes. If you look at the higher up leaves, you will sometimes see that they're completely round and smooth. This is good as a bedding material, so if you lay this down, which I've done in some of my other videos, and then you lay some other branches or leaf matter on top of it just to protect you from the spikes, it actually creates, because of the wavy shape of the leaf, it creates quite a nice spongy platform that moves as you lie on it. So that's quite good. Ilex aquifolium. Aquifolium meaning wet leaf, because it looks shiny and wet. And then behind that we have beech, I think. Yeah, beech. So some giveaways for this are usually smooth bark. I have seen some beech with rough, wrinkled bark, but it's normally quite flat as opposed to broken up into plates. The leaves hang on, so very often you'll see hedges and trees with the brown leaves. Even now, which is February, early February, the leaves are still on, and then in spring these will actually drop off and release toxins into the ground to stop other plants growing. So the floor underneath a beech tree is usually quite sparse of other vegetation. And in terms of the buds, they are alternating, so they're not opposite each other like elder, and they're very pointy, so I think they're really easy to identify. So there's a point to each bud. And if you look up in the canopy, you can often see all these points against the bright sky. Beech is fairly similar to hornbeam, but with beech, the buds will point out away from the stem a lot. So you see this is the main stem, and this is coming out almost at right angles, whereas with hornbeam it will be pressed in slightly more like that. Also with hornbeam, the bud will be more rounded than that, it won't quite be so pointy, and it will be fatter, so it will look like a little fat cigar. Okay, let's have a walk down here. Beech has edible nuts. Leaves are edible in the spring. The Latin Fagus Sylvatica. Fagus means edible and Sylvatica means of the forest. There's a lot of beech in this area. So up ahead it looks like we've got some larch, Larix Decidua. Let's go and have a closer look. So it's a deciduous tree, so it's dropped all of its leaves. So it's these tall ones here. So they grow straight and tall. They're quite good for woodwork, sort of like flooring planks and things like that. This has the bark that's breaking off into plates. Quite gnarly textured bark. And the key giveaway is the cones. So if you look up into the canopy, you'll see the shadow or the outline of round cones in the branches. And probably under this snow, try and find, yeah, oh, this is a shoot. So on the shoot here, it's really, really knobbly and gnarly. So you've got all these sort of buds coming off, really knobbly. And you'll find the big cones as well. If I look for a dead branch, here we go. So that's the cone. That's the round cone. So that's the dead giveaway for larch. Really good firewood, fire starters. Just go and grab handfuls of that, take the cones off because they hold moisture, and get your fire started with that. And here's a larger larch, growing quite straight. And you can see on the lower branches the outlines of the dark round cones. Where's this coming from? Oak, I think. So it's got some of the leaves hanging on, so I think instant reaction was that it was beech, but it's clearly not. If you look at the leaf, it's an oak leaf. And the thing with oak is bud clustering. So there you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 buds sort of clustered all together. So cherry and oak both have that. So this will be a Quercus species. And the leaves don't have stalks, which means the acorns will have stalks. So that will be a English oak, Quercus Robur. Gnarly bark. Whoa. So that bark will get a lot more gnarled as the tree ages. Really good firewood, really hard wood, robust wood. You can extract tannins from the bark for tanning hides. They used to make ink from the galls in the acorns. You can get black ink from it, that's what the Magna Carta was written in. Acorns you can ground up and leach the tannins out in water or dry frying, and then you can make that into a meal, and you can make coffee out of it or bread out of it, porridgey sort of gruel out of it. Quercus Robur. So this is beech straight away because of these long, try and get it outlined against the snow there, long pointy buds. Okay, it looks like we've got a birch over here. Let's go and have a closer look. 2 birches. So you've got a leaning birch and a straight birch. So I noticed the white bark, although it's not always white, you can have red or dark coloured bark. And then looking up, there are 2 main sorts of birch that we get, downy birch and silver birch. and you get hybrids as well. So this isn't a silver. Silver birch is Betula pendula, so the branches hang down pendulously, especially the tips of the thin branches, whereas these are quite upright and they're growing quite strongly, which means it's either downy birch or it's a hybrid between silver and downy. So this is a great fire starter. The outer bark of this, peel off, use that as your fire starter. You can use it for bow drill, the wood inside, carving. You can make containers out of the bark by folding it. You can tap it in the spring and drink the sap that comes out, or cut a branch and drink the sap that comes out. You can distill, dry heat the bark and the wood and distill a tar from it, which you can use as a glue and a waterproofer. Pretty useful tree. So here's another holly tree, Ilex Aqufolium. And you can see the trunk in there, so it's quite a big holly tree, so they can get quite big. It's a very hard wood, so it's rubbish for bow drill, but quite good for making wedges for splitting logs apart. But I wanted to show you the leaf here, how it's lost its spines. So the higher up leaves, because they're not worried about being browsed on or grazed on by deer, they don't need their spines. So often if you look up, it's a bit hard in this light, but you'll see there's some with half spines and some that are just completely smooth. But that's holly. We've got some evergreens coming up over there. You can just see some green foliage, so we can go and check those out. Here is a good example of how beech hangs onto its leaves. So all the leaves still hanging on there, and then come March, April time they'll all drop off and the new ones will start opening. Okay, so this is Western Hemlock, Tsuga Heterophylla. So Heterophylla means different leaves, and if I pull a leaf off to have a look at, hopefully you can see that each leaf is a different length. So you've got some long ones and some short ones. So that's how you know it's Western Hemlock, Tsuga Heterophylla. Heterophylla meaning different leaves. It does look very similar to spruce though, but spruce would have quite stiff leaves as well, whereas that's quite soft. I got some wood to use as a bow drill from Western Hemlock and it worked really, really well. So something like that, use as a spindle, and carve a baseboard from it as well. Brilliant, really good. In fact, that's a perfect bit there, standing deadwood. That would make a great bow drill set. Let's maybe try and I want to find some hazel actually to practice bow drill, so let's try and find one or two more trees and then wrap it up for a bit of a shorter video this time. Okay, I found some hazel. So distinctive features of hazel are multiple stems, so it's a cross between a tree and a shrub. So even if it hasn't been coppiced, you'll probably get several stems coming out of a tree base, and if it has been coppiced you can get 20 or 30 stems coming up, so that's one of the key points. The other point is shiny bark, so it has quite a sheen to it, as does cherry and birch, but that's another point to look for. And then in terms of the buds, they're quite small and round, and they often tend to be green on one side and red on the other, so that's green. So if we flip it over, that's more of a slightly reddish colour. It's more pronounced on some branches than others. So this one, for example, I'll just get my screen back. So that is pretty green on that side, and then if you flip it over, it's it's more reddish on that side, so green then red. You've got these white dots on the branch which are the lenticels, which allow for gas exchange. So that's hazel, so I'm after a bit of dead hazel for my bow drill. The way to tell if it's dead is just make a little scrape on the bark. It's quite hard with one hand. See, I've just done a tiny one so as not to damage the tree. But if that is brown underneath, then it's dead. And if it's green, it's living. So I'll just do a bigger one so you can see it this time. So see the green edge, that means it's a living stem. Obviously if it's got other telltale signs, or if it's got leaves on it in spring or summer, then it's living. If it's flexible, then it's living. That would just snap off if it was dead. And the dead ones often look darker in colour as well. So even though this one's gnarly, it could well be living. It probably is. There you go, it's light green, so it's living. So I'm going to go on a bit of a hunt for some dead hazel. So the way to look for that is, rather than looking in open spaces like this where there's plenty of light, there will be some dead wood here, but the real dead wood is going to be in where it's dense, where there's less light and the branches are going to die off. So I'm going to go and have a look in there. So I just spotted some dead beech here, and although it's not very good for bow drill, I've never tried it, and I'm up for trying all the different woods. So ash is also supposed to be difficult for bow drill, and I got a bow drill fire with ash last week. So I'm going to take a piece of this. It's still a little bit flexible, so I might just leave it drying at home for a week before I try it. The bark's fallen off, and even though there's still buds on it, it's snapping, it's cracking. So let's take a piece of this. So now that I've released that, I can just take a piece. Maybe take it there. So it looks quite nice. It's very hard, but I think that's worth a try for bow drill. So I'm going to take that home with me. There's a baby oak tree here, really young sapling. I think they grow about 60 centimetres a year as saplings, so that's probably 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 years old. And you can see the bud clustering there. So that's where all the leaves will cluster around, with the acorns in the middle. Let's find a better example. Here's a good example, really good example. So you can see all those buds at the tip rather than just one bud on the end of the twig. So that's typical of Quercus Robur, English oak, and all the oaks, and cherry. The bark on that is a light brown, whereas cherry would be sort of reddish with white tints on it. Cherry also has slightly less clustering, and it has really noticeable white lenticels, which are the little dots on the branch, and shinier bark as well. It's a gnarly old beech here with a lot of wounds to it. So it's been wounded here or had an infection, and it's growing over this cambium layer to try and seal it up. But all the way up it's wounded, so I think that's on its last legs. I think these big ones are beech as well, and the only way to tell really is to try and look up, and I can see up at the top the spiky buds pointing out, which the other thing I thought this might be is ash, but looking up it's not ash. So I would say on these big trees you can get some of this ridging on beech, whereas mostly beech is quite smooth. Ash at this size would be much more pronounced. It would have thick diamond shaped ridging on it, and would have black buds rather than spiky buds. it's all beech, beech, beech here. My phone battery just died, which is, I was recording the audio on through my microphone, so it's not going to be quite as good audio now, but I just wanted to show you this cherry tree with its distinctive banding and reddish colour bark, although this has a lot of green algae growing on it, and it also tends to peel a lot, but I wouldn't pull that off because it will rip into the inner bark and kill the tree. Unlike birch, the birches, where if you peeled that it would just take the outer bark off and the tree would be fine. But that peeling banded bark, and it's normally a shiny bark as well. So that's Prunus Avium, wild cherry. It's quite a big one. And if you look towards the top you might be able to make out the shiny bark there, which is more typical, and it would have bud clustering if we could get to the buds to have a look. Okay, I think I'm just going to try and find a bit of dead hazel and then wrap it up. Ah, here's another cherry. Straight in front of us here. Let's go and have a look at that. Brown buds which cluster together at the top like oak. You see that? There's two buds there. So the buds here are darker in colour than oak and not as many clustered together. Oak has more clustering. The growth on cherry is also more regular, whereas oak is quirky. Quercus grows quirky, so it's kind of gnarly, and then the bark's different. Although on this young sapling the bark is fairly similar, but cherry does tend to have a whitish hue to it, which oak doesn't have. There's some tylosis going on, so that's all the sap oozing out to heal an injury. You can use that as chewing gum. I've tried it and it's horrible, but you can also use it as a glue, but it's water soluble, so it's not good for anything that's going to get wet. But you can see the nice sheen on that bark there, and the birds love to eat the cherries from that. Oh, there's quite a few now actually. These are all cherries in here now. So I've come to maybe a different soil type. So I think cherry tends to like poorer quality soil. So back in there is probably the established woodland, and this is maybe pioneer species in here. So we might expect to find some spruce, cherry and birch on this poorer quality patch of soil. It's not very dense though. I'm looking for some dense shaded out areas to find my dead hazel. Some hazel over here. Can instantly spot the clustering, sorry not the clustering, the multiple stems. Where am I? Just there. Let's go and have a look. Cherry, cherry, cherry now. Gone from beech to cherry. Yeah, so this is the hazel. That's what caught my eye from a distance if you're looking for hazel, is all these multiple stems coming out. This has probably been coppiced at some point in the past, but like I said earlier, they do grow like that anyway. So let's find me a dead bit. And whilst I'm doing that, for my bow drill video, which I'm going to post next, I think I'll by there. So hope that was useful and interesting, and I'll see you next time.